Have you ever wondered why one short story makes you literally want to sleep with the lights on, while another leaves you staring at the ceiling, pondering the deepest mysteries of the human heart? Well, it all comes down to genre. So let's just jump right into this explainer. We're going to map out the incredibly diverse landscape of short fiction together. And honestly, seeing how these categories work can completely transform the way you read.
To make sense of the whole shebang, we'll take a bit of a landscape tour. First, the trailhead. Then, worlds beyond reality, the inner experience. Stories grounded in the real, and finally, the summit.
Okay, part 1, the trailhead. Let's get our bearings in the storytelling landscape.
Right off the bat, we've got to realize that genres aren't these strict, rigid boxes where a story just goes to get trapped. Out in the wild, authors are constantly blending them. You might have a historical story that's deeply psychological, focusing heavily on a character's internal anxiety. Or picture science fiction blended with a dystopian society. You could even read a fantasy romance where magical worlds are really just a backdrop for human connection. Basically, these categories are incredibly fluid tools.
Moving on to Part 2, Worlds Beyond Everyday Reality. This is where we explore science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
Let's step way past the boundaries of our everyday reality, starting with science fiction. Sci-fi takes our current world and basically asks a massive what if. Like, what if AI takes our jobs, or the climate collapses? The setting might be, say, a totally fabricated spaceship, but that advanced tech is almost always a mirror. It's reflecting our very real, present-day hopes and, of course, our anxieties. Meanwhile, fantasy comes in and just completely rewrites the rules. It introduces magic, mythical creatures, and these sprawling, invented worlds that simply cannot exist here. But here's the secret. Beneath the dragons and the magic rings, fantasy is incredibly human. It uses these impossible, epic settings to explore universal, everyday struggles like courage, the burden of power, and that classic fight between good and evil.
Rounding out this first cluster is horror. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to remember here is that it is not all about physical monsters or cheap jump scares. True horror actually relies on isolation, uncertainty, and this just pervasive sense of dread. It uses suspenseful pacing to tap directly into our deepest social anxieties and our personal psychological vulnerabilities. It really gets under your skin.
So, when you're building your reader's toolkit for these imagined worlds, you've got to ask yourself this: what real-world struggles are hiding just beneath that fictional surface? Because whether you're dealing with haunted houses or distant galaxies, the author is usually issuing a warning about our very own society.
Okay, let's use this transition to shift our focus entirely. We're going to step away from the external world building, the spaceships and the magic systems, and turn the lens completely inward to see how stories can be built primarily around internal landscapes.
Which brings us to Part 3, Exploring the Inner Experience. We're diving into literary, psychological, and romance fiction.
First up is literary fiction. And what makes this genre so fascinating is that it deliberately trades that fast-paced, plot-driven action for deep, deep emotional excavation. The focus here is really on the sheer beauty of the language itself. You're going to find highly introspective characters and ambiguous endings that are literally left wide open for us to interpret.
Then, psychological fiction takes that introspection even further. It makes the central conflict almost entirely internal. This genre absolutely loves to play with perception. You'll frequently encounter unreliable narrators. Like, suddenly you realize, wait a second, I might not be able to trust the person actually telling me the story. The tension isn't coming from some villain outside the house. It's entirely inside the character's own mind.
And then we have romance fiction. This focuses primarily on our connections with one another. Yes, for sure, it centers on love, but it's truly a deep exploration of vulnerability, intimacy, and that raw struggle to build trust. So whether it ends happily or explores profound heartbreak, the real core engine of the story is driven by human connection.
So what goes into your toolkit for the inner experience? Well, you should ask yourself, how do these highly specific language choices actually shape the deeper meaning? What themes are bubbling up? And crucially, can I even trust the narrator's perception of what's happening in the first place?
Now here is where it gets really interesting. We are going to pull ourselves right out of that abstract, internal mind and step firmly back out into tangible, physical reality.
Welcome to Part 4, Grounded in the Real. Here we're exploring historical, mystery, and realism.
Let's kick this off with historical fiction. This genre anchors its narrative in real, documented past events. Even if the main characters are totally made up out of thin air, their world is strictly bound by true history. It's incredibly powerful because it acts like an emotional time machine. It helps us connect to massive, sweeping realities, like war or huge social changes, but all through the very personal eyes of a single character.
Next up, we have mystery fiction, which is a genre entirely driven by hidden truths, missing information, deception, hidden clues. The whole engine relies on unanswered questions. And what makes this so intensely engaging is that it turns you, the reader, into a detective. It literally forces you to actively uncover the truth right alongside the characters.
This brings us to a really fascinating nuance, the difference between realism and social realism. Realism attempts to portray highly believable everyday experiences, stuff like going to work or navigating your family dynamics. But social realism takes that exact same everyday setting and uses it to critique systemic inequalities. So basically, realism might show us a family sitting down to dinner, while social realism focuses on the fact that the family is struggling to even afford that dinner because of systemic poverty or class injustice.
So, your toolkit for grounded fiction requires you to be highly observant. You need to constantly be asking yourself, how do historical events shape the character's opportunities? What crucial information is being intentionally hidden from me by the author? And what underlying social structures are quietly being critiqued right behind the scenes of ordinary life?
And finally, Part 5, The Summit. Let's talk about why story types actually matter.
We've trekked through all these different territories, which brings us to the absolute most important question of this explainer. Why does all this matter? Well, it matters because recognizing these patterns gives you immense power as a reader. Knowing the genre immediately sets your expectations. It allows you to analyze an author's choices, interpret underlying themes a lot more deeply, and basically engage with the text on a much more thoughtful level.
I really want to highlight this beautiful quote from our source material, mostly because it perfectly summarizes our journey today. Short fiction exists in many different forms because stories explore human experience in many different ways. You see, these genres don't just exist to organize bookshelves at the library. Sometimes we need a futuristic spaceship to understand our own society. And sometimes we just need an honest, quiet conversation across a kitchen table.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. The next time you open up a piece of short fiction, which of these tools are you going to use to uncover its true meaning? Will you look for the hidden social critique, the deep psychological anxiety, or maybe a universal theme completely wrapped in magic? Keep these lenses ready and honestly watch how the stories you read just completely transform. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and happy reading.